Hello, Bill Walsh, Center of the American Experiment, with the American Experiment podcast. In today's podcast, we're going to run through our summer presentation, which just finished, called False Promises, How Progressive Policies Betrayed Minnesota's Youth. And here to start it out is our president, John Hinterrocker.
Well, last year, as you might remember, our summer tour was titled Off the Cliff, and it was about some of the terrible things that the Minnesota legislature did in 2023. And this year, we thought it would be interesting to do something completely different and focus on young people in Minnesota. And to my knowledge, nobody's ever tried to poll young people in Minnesota to see how they are feeling about things, what they're thinking about things. So we talked to our pollster and asked, is that something that we could viably do? And the pollster said, absolutely. And our pollster is Rob Autry of Meeting Street Insights, which is a well-known national pollster out of South Carolina. And so what they did was to survey Minnesotans aged 18 through 34. Now, the results that we found when we surveyed young Minnesotans were frankly shocking. Tim Walsh likes to say that Minnesota is a great state for young people because you can get abortions here and you can smoke marijuana here, plentifully available. Well, young people, in fact, are not buying that theory. That certainly is what our polling found. In fact, what we found is a deep level of pessimism among Minnesota's young people. The most shocking statistic, in my view, is we asked the respondents, do you think your generation is economically better off than your parents' generation, worse off than your parents' generation, or about the same? 90% of young people in Minnesota said their generation is worse off than their parents' generation. Our pollster was stunned at that. He said, you can't get 90% of the people to agree on anything. And then we also asked, do you think the next generation after yours is going to be economically better off, worse off, or about the same as your generation? And again, the result is incredibly pessimistic. 68% said that they believe the next generation is going to be even worse off than theirs. And so what we're seeing is that a large majority of young Minnesotans believe that they are living in an era of long-term decline. Just a deeply, deeply pessimistic result.
And one of the other things we did this year, in addition to polling, is we pulled together a focus group of young people to kind of get to some narratives and some stories to tell along with the polling. Polling can be dry sometimes. And so here's Olivia on this question of generation, is my generation doing better than the past generation?
I don't think my generation is going to do better than my parents. I was just talking to my family about this, looking at my aunts and uncles and my mom and how post-college or post-grad for them, it was automatically, I'm moving to this state to work at my job. I'm getting an apartment here. And even in the summers, they would my mom went to Wyoming to work for a company every summer. And that was just completely normal, where I feel like now a lot of my friends, we go home, live at home, work, but you can't really make enough to live on your own. And now in post-grad life, you still I've lived at home for 6 months trying to save up money to be able to move out and live that way, where that just wasn't a thing for them before.
So we asked a number of other questions of our young respondents. We asked, do you think that the United States is going in the right direction or the wrong direction? And we found that 81% of young people in Minnesota are dissatisfied with the direction of the country, 45% dissatisfied with the direction of the state. That the state numbers, it's interesting because everybody's dissatisfied at the federal level. The state numbers are very partisan because 87% of Democrats think the state's going in the right direction, 87% of Republicans think it's going in the wrong direction. So that accounts for the difference there. We also asked about trust in government, and you can see it in this slide. And the bottom line is young Minnesotans have hardly any trust in government at all, especially at the federal level. There's 1%, hardly 1% of young Minnesotans say they trust the federal government all the time, always to do the right thing. And then another 10% usually trust the federal government to do the right thing. The vast majority are not so optimistic.
So what's driving all this pessimism? Well, now we can turn to some of the specific issues that we talk to young people about, both in our poll and in our focus groups, about kind of why they don't have a lot of hope for the future, have a lot of pessimism. And it starts with housing. Housing's really the biggest issue. When we talked to the panel about the American dream, what's your definition of the American dream? Housing came up obviously first. I want to own a house. Home ownership is really the core of the definition of the American dream. But consider this, in Minnesota right now, home ownership is tough for this generation. The average prices you're going to see in a minute, the average price of a home in Minneapolis and the Twin Cities is $369,000. If you want to put a 10% down payment on that, that's $36,000. Interest rates are at like 7%. So the cost to get into a house is really high. Plus, you're sitting in an apartment at really high rates because of the housing shortage that's driven up prices for rent. So you might be paying upwards of $1,500 to $2,000 a month in rent, trying to save money for that down payment and pay that extra interest rate. So we asked poll respondents about this, and of course, this was another really high number in our poll. When it comes to housing, 84% are concerned about their ability to buy a house in Minnesota. And let's hear a young married couple on our panel talk about this very struggle.
One of the challenges right now is to be able to save. Thankfully, we both don't have any school debt or loans, anything like that. So that's a huge advantage. But I feel like a lot of people have those, and then with inflation, it's just harder to be able to budget or save a lot towards a down payment or be able to buy a house. So that's just like a huge challenge right now, to budget for groceries, gas, and just all these other things that just add up. I feel like we're doing a good job at budgeting right now, but still it feels like it's so hard to save, or we want to save more, but everything is so expensive with inflation right now.
Kenneth is definitely right on point. I can tell you myself, as a 28-year-old, I've had Zillow for like so many years. I go there randomly, just to check out these 1-bedroom condos, 2-bedroom townhouses. And I cannot afford it. I'm not even close to affording either of those. Even if I stopped eating for a whole year, I cannot afford a house right now, even a 1-bedroom condo.
If people would donate more money to AmericanExperiment.org, they can hit the donate button. We could raise Martha's salary to get her to afford a house. Sorry, go ahead. That was a good segue for a commercial.
I second that, yeah.
Yes, okay.
But anyway, this is not even just me. I have friends that are starting out their lives. They're in that age where they're having kids, but they're having to do that in apartments because they can't afford to buy a house. So the housing that they can afford is not what they want. And I mean, you look at the numbers, you've mentioned this, and it's easy to see why. Of course, right now you have high interest rates, but even the cost of housing from 5 years ago was still cost prohibitive. If you're looking at the median home in the Twin Cities right now, so this is right there in the middle, 50% above, 50% below, that house is $369,000. If you're looking at 1970, which is about 50 years ago, that same house right in the middle is going to be about $74,000. So the median home is now over 5 times what it was, 50 years ago.
Yeah, my first house was early 1990s, $114,000.
See, just like that,
It was doable for me.
Yeah. So of course, incomes have grown, over that period of time. So just comparing those prices wouldn't give you a complete picture. We did another comparison between how incomes have grown compared to these home values over the years. And again, so this was just between 2000 and 2022. If you're looking at the median home price, it's grown about 147%. So it's more than doubled. So, but then if you're looking at income over that same period, it's just grown by like 67%. So not even half of half as high as the growth in home prices. So it's easy to see why young people are disgruntled about the housing market.
Well, that's the Minnesota story. How do we rank and kind of hold up against the rest of the Midwest or the rest of the country?
Yeah, so in a lot of ways, this is a recurring theme throughout this whole talk. There's issues going around all over the country, but in a lot of ways, Minnesota has it worse. So if you're looking at housing, we did take a look at, the 10 biggest metros in the Midwest. So we're looking at home value to income ratios. So Minneapolis-St. Paul region actually was number 9. So it was the second least affordable metro region among the top 10. So we only ranked second to Milwaukee. Chicago's, just right there. It's the biggest metro in the Midwest, and it's more affordable than the Twin Cities.
So the promise here, the false promise is you're going to be able to afford a house and achieve the American dream. The betrayal in policy then is what we kind of go do next. So what policies are making Minnesota stand out in the rest of the country, and also making this generation make it so tough as opposed to their parents?
Yeah, there's a lot of things going on. I hear a lot of people, blaming corporations, greedy landlords, but they're just, a tiny, very tiny segment of the housing market. When you dig deeper into it, you're looking at all these regulations that we have at the state level, but also at the local level, that just make it hard for developers to come in and build the type of housing that people want. So just to give an example, we have the state building code. I think there's probably thousands of rules in there of what developers have to follow. It dictates everything from your foundation to the ceiling, what kind of materials you should use for your walls, your doors, your ceiling, all of that stuff. And then of course we have energy saving rules, because we've made it a mission in Minnesota here to combat climate change. That comes with its own cost. So we have these energy efficacy rules. You have to have a certain percentage of your lamps have to have a certain level of efficacy or efficiency.
So it sounds good, feels good, but it's going to drive up the cost of the
house. It drives
house.
up the cost of the house. But then if you're looking at your installation as well, there's certain rules telling you how thick your walls have to be or what kind of materials you have to use. Again, all of those things reduce the flexibility that developers have. They cannot use more affordable materials. They have to follow a certain standard. So again, you have less affordable housing because of that. And then of course you go to the local level, then you have zoning rules. There's in a lot of Minnesota, a lot of the land is zoned for single family house, so you can't have duplexes, triplexes, townhomes in a lot of areas,
Which gives that range of cost, like I can afford a townhouse or a duplex or live in a triplex. But if you have minimum lot sizes and multi or a single family home zoning, it just takes that out of the mix.
Yeah, it takes it out of the mix. And a lot of people, in their 20s, 30s, they cannot afford to just go buy a 4-bedroom house. They need that, starter home, which is where the townhomes come in. So of course,
you hear that at the legislature now. The starter home has been made illegal.
It's basically been made illegal. But couple places like Minneapolis-St. Paul are trying to, solve this thing. So maybe that will improve our housing supply. And then, of course, you just mentioned the minimum lot sizes. So this is, this is part of what we call density restrictions. So, you cannot build a house in a lot of areas with a size that's less than 4,000 square feet. Now, of course, this differs from area to area, so it's going to be different depending on where you're building. And then if you're building multi-family housing as well, there's height restrictions on those. You cannot go above a certain number of stories. Again, that limits the number of units you're going to have in that building. So
which could hurt housing supply and rents.
And rents, yeah. Yep. So, and then I think this is really the most ridiculous part of housing regulations. These aesthetic mandates, they don't do anything to the quality or safety.
And we're not talking safety.
No. It's just you go into these certain areas whereby they are trying to keep the character of the neighborhood or the town or anything like. So they'll tell you have to use
earth tones and this certain kind of brick.
Yes, certain kind of brick. You have to plant maybe a certain number of bushes to make the place look nice. Again, all of that doesn't do anything to quality safety, but it's going to increase the price that house is going to to go for.
And we have a good example of that in the presentation here, where we had that kind of comparison between Minnesota and Wisconsin.
Yeah, I think this really pretty much encapsulates what the problem is in Minnesota. So this is data from 2019. So Minnesota Housing First did a survey with construction companies, how much it would cost to build a house in Minnesota as opposed to Wisconsin. So this is Lake Elmo and Hudson. So these are places that are just 10 miles
very
apart.
Close.
So this is same size house. All of the features are similar. This is the same developer. If you're building that house in Lake Elmo, it's going to cost you about close to $380,000. But then the same house in Hudson is going to be like about $330,000. So that's a difference of about $50,000
For the same house.
Yeah, for the same house, and a lot of that difference is just due to these,
Well, it has to be.
ridiculous
It's the only thing left.
laws that we have.
Yeah.
We have in the state. So.
It has to be on the regulations. It's the only thing left to talk about.
Yeah.
Well, thank you to our economist, Martha Jolamoli. You're going to be back in a few minutes to do childcare with us, but that wraps up our housing piece.
All right. Thank you, Bill.
Okay, a couple other miscellaneous issues that we asked our young people in the poll kind of gets to this affordability crisis. We talked about housing, but also, we asked them, how concerned are you about paying back your student loans? 60% of our young people in Minnesota very concerned about paying back student loans. How concerned are you about making your car payment, a monthly car payment? Again, 60% of young Minnesotans concerned about making that monthly car payment. All right, so you found a way to pay for a house. Let's say you've got the mortgage figured out, you've got the down payment, the interest rate, all this figured out. Now the next step is, can I find a safe neighborhood? Can I find a house where public safety isn't a top concern? And it turns out in our poll, public safety was a very big top concern with our young people. We asked them, how concerned are you about your own public safety? 64% of our poll respondents said they're concerned about public safety. Now, that's actually the lower end of the number in terms of all the age groups. When we poll this question a lot in Minnesota, in our Thinking Minnesota poll, and you want to look at older women, 55 and up, they are really concerned, like in the 90 percentile, concerned about their own public safety. But even this young group, who really shouldn't be, have 64% talking about concern over public safety. Let's listen to Jade. She's a student at the U of M, just recently graduated, and she can talk about her own personal experience at the U of M and her personal safety.
We've had friends get robbed at gunpoint. We've had friends get their car stolen. I've had multiple friends get their car stolen. A few really good friends of mine have had their phones stolen. It's always females too, most of the time, that get targeted. Wallets, phones, MacBooks. Literally, our friend walking on campus gets his AirPods ripped out of his hand. I live downtown Minneapolis. My apartment lease just ended May 31st. I saw multiple shootings out my bedroom window this year. I remember I took a video on my phone of them, and the police came and had me email them for evidence. Had to email them videos for them. Just seeing where I live and seeing like my brother's friends that went to the U of M and the experience they had, and being able to go to the bars and walk around after and like get pizza with your friends. Like, no, you can't do that. Like, it is literally Gotham City, and it is very scary. And hearing gunshots every night when you go to bed as a student on campus is not normal. And my friends who went to Iowa State never experienced that. My brother went to Wisconsin. He never experienced that. And so it's just sad that was my college experience.
Isn't that sad? Students at our signature university describing their college experience as living in Gotham City and having to experience witnessing robberies and carjackings and multiple shootings on campus. Again, in our Twin City campus, it's just unheard of, and it's inexcusable, and I think it contrasts sharply with the picture that many progressive leaders have tried to paint, that crime is down. We've seen those headlines recently. And while crime has dipped from the last couple of years, the truth is our crime rates remain far above where they were just 5 years ago. So I've put a chart together showing that, for example, if you combine assault and murders, those remain up 48% from where they were in 2019 statewide, and robbery is 11% higher than where it was in 2019, and it's even worse in our urban areas.
2019 is a good baseline because it's sort of pre-COVID, pre-riots. That's a good baseline.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Another slide we put together really brings it home for this presentation, which is who are the victims of this random violent crime, and more often it's our youth. 58%, nearly 6 of 10 people that are victimized by what we call person crimes, such as murder, assault, rape, those types of crimes. Those are committed against people under the age of 35 in Minnesota. So again, it really hits home with who's paying the price for this increase in violent crime in our state. Another chart I put together when I joined Center of the American Experiment in 2022 demonstrates that while the national crime rate was decreasing, Minnesota's began rising. And again, it began rising well before anyone had heard of the name George Floyd or the disease COVID and such. And it makes you wonder what was going on in Minnesota where we were bucking that trend. And I'd submit that it was the creation and implementation of a lot of progressive criminal justice and public safety policies that really undermined law enforcement. It demoralized law enforcement, and it emboldened the criminal element. And sure enough, what we get is a rise in crime.
And just a little note on this chart. We've tried to update this chart, but the FBI actually stopped or changed the way they track these, what was called Part 1 crimes. So this chart we have to retire. You've got a new chart. If you go to AmericanExperiment.org and look for David's latest post on crime rates, you'll find a new chart with better data, more recent data, basically.
Right. In short, I can recreate Minnesota's crime rate going forward, but I can't recreate the national crime rate. So that chart, like you said, I have to retire.
We're
it.
retiring this chart. It's had a good run. It was on Sean Hannity last week, and it's done very well. Okay, so let's get into the policy betrayal. We talk about the false promise of you can live in a safe Minnesota. The betrayal by policy is long when it comes to public safety. What's driving this? What's happening at the legislature or not happening at the legislature that's kind of driving this recent crime issue?
So our legislature claims to be taking steps to address violent crime, but when you examine what they're passing, the laws that they're passing, that claim is really weak. Let's use carjacking, for example. Minnesota experienced about a 500% increase in carjacking earlier in this decade. So the legislature responded by creating a new law outlawing carjacking.
That's good. That's a good thing.
Well, on its face, it is, and you know we all kind of applauded it until we read the law, and it really was just window dressing. The act of carjacking was always prosecuted. It was always against the law. Police would always arrest an offender if they could, and the prosecutors would prosecute them for robbery. But now the legislature stood up and said, we're really going to fight back against this scourge of carjacking, and we've created a new law. In effect, it was just the paper that they typed the law on. It wasn't really worth anything because there was no additional penalty. There was no deterrent effect with this new law beyond what was already in existence. What we did is took that and we went and put some pressure on the Minnesota Sentencing Guideline Commission. They get the new laws and they have to apply penalties
from the grid.
Yep,
Yep.
Exactly. And so there was every indication they were just going to kind of allow this to proceed the way the legislature had maybe intended it to proceed, and that was no new effect. We initiated a campaign, elicited support from our followers to communicate with the Sentencing Guideline Commission. Thousands of emails and letters were sent to the Sentencing Guideline Commission, making it clear that the public wanted, more penalties for carjacking than what was being proposed. And so because of that effort, the Sentencing Guideline Commission properly voted to increase the penalties for this new law. And now carjacking, the penalty for carjacking in Minnesota is now commensurate with third-degree murder, which is a great victory for public safety.
Yeah, so everybody out there watching and listening that has gotten our emails from American Experiment saying, please send a letter or send an email to your senator, your governor, your state representative, your county commissioner, in this case, Sentencing Guidelines Commission members. It actually works sometimes.
Right.
They actually listen because we sent thousands of, not tens of thousands, but I think 3,000 or 4,000 emails. It was overwhelming in majority of what they received from comments. And they thought, you know what, we better take this more seriously. And they agreed. And so a victory there where the system works and people listen.
Right.
We give them credit for listening and then taking a second look. And now you've got carjacking as a new law and a decent penalty to hold them accountable.
Yep. that public engagement really paid off, and in combination with an aggressive federal prosecutor in our area, our U.S. attorney made a specific effort to prosecute anyone committing, any adult committing the act of carjacking in the state. And those two efforts have really combined to, we've seen a decrease in carjacking in the last year in Minnesota.
All right, last few things the legislature's done in the area of public safety, or not done.
Well, so they've also touted that they've gotten tough on gun crime, but what they've done is pass a number of laws that just arguably restrict the rights of legal gun ownership while avoiding doing anything to increase penalties against criminals using guns. Currently, and sadly, in our state right now, we have mandatory minimum sentencing that's pretty robust.
Good.
If used correctly, for anyone that uses a gun in the commission of a crime. But unfortunately, by the time it gets to sentencing, what we're seeing is about half of those criminals convicted of crimes where a gun was used in commission of the crime, only half of those are actually getting sentenced using the minimum sentencing guidelines.
This is that revolving door of justice that you've written about a lot.
Exactly, exactly. And if you can believe it, I think our last slide in this section deals with felon in possession. So that's always been on our books where, if somebody has a felony record and they're caught in possession of a firearm, which they're prohibited from possessing, again, there's mandatory minimum sentencing for that kind of a crime. In this past session, our legislature, unbelievably, they introduced legislation. They didn't pass it, but they introduced legislation that if it had passed, it would have actually reduced the penalty for being a felon in possession of a firearm. So once again, they talk big, but they really aren't following it up.
Well, again, it's that focus on offenders and not on victims.
Right.
I mean, who in their right mind would propose this with everything that's going on in the world right now?
Right.
And thankfully, it didn't pass.
Thankfully.
Well, thank you, Policy Fellow for Public Safety, David Zimmer, and that's going to end it for that. And we'll move on to our next topic, childcare.
Thanks, Bill.
So the next step in the life continuum would be childcare. Okay, you've got a house, you're in a safe neighborhood. Now we're going to have some kids, and we got to start paying for childcare. Now we didn't do any polling on childcare, and we didn't have any panelists that had children. I really wanted to find people on our panels that had children, but we do have Jade, who kind of gives you that secondhand perspective on childcare as a young person. But I think she really gets it. I think she really nails it.
So I have a lot of cousins who are older than me and have kids right now. And they are sending their kids to like home daycares, like women who like run daycares out of their home, because it's almost cheaper to do that than go to a daycare. And actually, one of my friends who works in childcare said that it's almost, you break even if a mom stays home from work and doesn't work than if you have like 3 to 4 kids and you're putting them all in childcare. Like, you pay so much money. Those daycare centers are extremely crazy expensive. I forget, like per kid, even if your kid's sick and they have to stay home from school, you still have to pay for their spot.
Yeah, Jed is definitely right on this. The price of childcare, much like housing, has gone up, over the last couple of decades. So one thing that we did was look at the, consumer price index, which is the inflation level of childcare compared to all of the other items. Of course, over time, prices are always going up. So when you're looking at everything else, since 1990, prices have about more than doubled. But then if you look at childcare, it has more than tripled. So this is a difference of about 125% in growth in those 30 years.
So childcare is actually driving inflation as a whole.
But then if you're living in Minnesota, of course, you have this double whammy because prices are always going up everywhere. But then in Minnesota, not only are prices rising, but we have some of the highest costs in the country in childcare. So if you look at 2022, which is the most recent year that we have data, if you have an infant, which is a child between 6 weeks and 16 months, if you're sending them to a licensed daycare center, so these are the big centers that have like 100, 200 kids at a time, you're going to be paying about $17,400 for childcare, which if you're a median household income, that is 21% of your income going just to pay for your kid at
that's
daycare.
the largest expense in the family. That's probably bigger than the mortgage, probably.
Yeah, it's the largest expense. If it's actually cheaper to pay for a teenager to go to college than it is to pay for an infant to go to a daycare center. It's the same with toddlers too. You know, you're paying at least 90% of your income on childcare. So just going back to the infants, actually, in that year, Minnesota was the 6th most expensive state in the country if you take out California. And then if you go to toddlers, the same thing. We're like number 8, and then the 4-year-olds we're like number 4 or something like that. So regardless of the age or whatever, parents are paying a lot of money to send their kids to daycare. Now, of course, we also have the cheaper options. We have the small providers. So these are the people, mostly women, that decide to take care of kids in their homes. So there's been a couple of parents who have kids and they're like, they don't want to go back to the office. So they set up a childcare facility in their home. They take care of about 10, 12 kids at a time. Now, these ones are a little bit more affordable. So you can pay about half of that, what you pay at a daycare center. The problem, however, is the last couple of decades, these providers have been going out of the market. So in 2000, about 2/3 of the total capacity in Minnesota was made up entirely of these small providers. But then over the years, they've just fallen off. So now they make up about 1/3 of all of the capacity. So you have more and more of the capacity being made up of the more expensive providers.
That's the red line kind of going down. You can see it going down over those years.
So you can see it over the years now. More of the capacity is being provided by the centers. However, if you go to like greater Minnesota, right? So these areas are less dense than the metro. They have fewer kids. You know, people have low income. So it's very hard to set up a center in greater Minnesota. So when these small providers leave, actually nothing comes to replace that. So you have parents that not only can afford childcare, but they can't even find it.
Yeah. All right. So what's driving it? We've been talking about the false promise that you're going to have childcare available, affordable, and accessible. But the reality is they've been betrayed by policies coming from St. Paul that makes us different than the rest of the country. What's driving this now?
Yeah, it's really a lot of it is regulation. So, you know, like I said, the last couple of decades, the family childcare providers have been exiting the market. If you ask them right now, a lot of people that have gone out of the market, they're going to tell you, we were just, you know, being hit by rules after rules. Just, you know, it makes it hard for them to operate. Just to give an example, it takes about 2 years for like, say a lady decides to set up the daycare in their home. It takes them 2 years to go through that process, and they have to make so many adjustments to their homes too. That costs like thousands of dollars just to do that. Some of them have just been, you know, just deciding that it's not worth the cost. And then if you go to the centers, it's the same thing too. Like, we have very burdensome staff-child ratios. Just to give an example, if you're taking care of infants in Minnesota, you have to have a 1-to-4 ratio. So that means for every 4 infants, you have to have one,
paid staffer.
Yeah.
Yep.
But then if you go to other states, they can have, 5 infants, which means that cost has been spread around a little bit more parents as opposed to here. So again, you have to raise prices to be able to have more staff per kids. And then you look at the staff itself, like what it takes to hire somebody to be qualified. We have so many, education requirements, training requirements. Right now, I think if you're trying to be a teacher, there's a couple of avenues you can go through too, but a lot of them do have a lot of requirements. So
like a 4-year degree.
A 4-year degree is one. If you don't have a degree, maybe you have a high school diploma. You have to work for a year to be an assistant teacher, and then after that you have to work 2 more years before you become a teacher. But then if you go to like North Dakota, Wisconsin, you just need to take some training before you start caring for kids, and then you're ready to take care of kids.
And this is the classic balance issue, right? I mean, we overregulate in Minnesota, drive up the cost, drive down the accessibility, availability of childcare. In the name of what? In the name of, I assume we're doing it, if someone was here defending it, they would say safety, probably number one. but it's just that trade-off, right?
Yeah, there is a trade-off. Yeah, they say safety, they talk about quality, but there's a lot of research out there that shows you that all of these regulations actually don't do very much for quality. So all they do is just, you're making it hard for these people to take care of kids. They have to charge people more. They have to hire more people so this is interesting as well. So just a couple months ago, so this process actually started in 2021, right? The legislature passed this law to modernize childcare regulations in Minnesota. So then a couple of months ago, the Department of Human Services came up with the draft of new licensing laws. And you look at this thing, it's like 90 pages long. So this is
Yikes.
something that, if you're a woman, you just want to take care of kids in your house, you have to read this 90-page document just to be able to take care of kids and follow everything that's in there. So you add all of that up. It's like, who wants to get into that industry?
Right, and
like
one
that?
of the things we heard at one of our last presentations on this tour was that people are just going to go sort of black market. They're just going to be unlicensed home daycares in towns across Minnesota, which is not really good for anybody, but it's just a natural outgrowth of too much regulation.
Yeah, definitely. The good things though is there was so much feedback going
Pushback.
to the DHS, so they decided to kind of wait on that. The original plan was they were going to give this draft to the legislature in 2025, and then legislature would decide whether to pass those new licensing standards or not. But then after that feedback, they've decided to kind of wait it out, so they're going to edit the draft and then hear more from these providers. So hopefully they change a lot of, actually maybe just even get rid of the of the new rules and just even try to reform a lot of the existing rules, just make childcare more affordable.
Well, and when they do, you will write about it at AmericanExperiment.org. They can check out your stuff because you'll be on top of it. All right, next topic is healthcare, and I'm joined by Senior Policy Fellow Peter Nelson. We're talking about healthcare and young people. And young people use less healthcare. They're more healthy. They're like the most healthy part of the population altogether. But as you'll see, they still think it's unaffordable in Minnesota. We asked, is healthcare affordable? And 47% believe healthcare is not affordable. 52% believe healthcare is affordable. So they're feeling that affordability crisis even at the healthcare level. And here's a couple of our panelists to talk about that.
My premiums have gone up quite a bit. I think every year they've gone up that I've been on my own for. This is my third year on my own insurance, and I think they've gone up every year.
I went to get a physical, like simple thing to just get done and, make sure that everything is fine. And then I get the bill, and it was like $600 just for a physical. I was like, what in the world? So of course they paid for most of it, but I still had to pay like $90 something. And I remember like when I was in high school, a physical was like maybe $100 or something. And that was crazy. I told her, like, that is insane. Like, just a physical $600, and then, how much for the surgery or something more complex. So that was kind of.
They're not wrong. Premiums are, in fact, going up. The latest premiums for next year are going up anywhere between 8 and 13%, depending on where you're getting insurance in Minnesota. And that's just what happens year after year after year. Healthcare costs go up faster than inflation. And so what's part of driving that? Well, one part of the thing that's driving that is basically the solution from the left. And by the way, we could get into a lot of
we don't have time to really do healthcare.
To talk about, because there's a lot of things driving it. But one thing we want to focus on right here is the fact that the left's position right now is just to simply solve these issues by just driving more and more people into a government program, as though a government program is somehow better than the private market space. And so when we look at all the people going to public programs, we see right now that 1.3 million people are enrolled in Medicaid. That's the insurance that we have for poor and disabled people. And another 104,000 are enrolled in Minnesota Care. That's for low-income working adults. And so add that to Medicare, all of a sudden there's a huge portion of the population that is in a government program, and the more people in the government programs, the less people that are in a private program that actually has incentives to control costs.
And Governor Walsh would brag about that number. That's kind of the perverse way people look at things. He would say, this is great. We're taking care of, one-fifth of the population of Minnesota is being taken care of by Medicaid. That's something to be proud of. I think it's something to be ashamed of. I think we should try to lower that because people are doing better in life and they're on a private system. But that's kind of the difference between us and them on healthcare. That kind of gets it. The false promise is you're going to get great healthcare in Minnesota. We hear about that all the time. But really, the betrayal by policy is exactly that, right? It's this drive to bring everybody into a government program.
Yeah, government program and just government control over the healthcare system. So some of the problems that we have simply are stem from the fact that the government mandates a lot of things. They mandate a lot of benefits in your insurance plan, and so that drives up the cost. They also restrict the providers from hospitals from expanding. There's a restriction on actually building out new hospital beds, which we've seen in the news quite regularly, shortages across the state. And that drives up the cost of care. And that's all driven by government policies that restrict the market to actually provide better care at a lower cost to more people.
And what are the ramifications of that, really? I mean, when it comes to me personally, I mean, with the lack of free market in our healthcare system.
Well, one, people tell us that the government is actually going to lower the cost of care, but the government keeps getting more and more involved and nothing changes with the cost of care. And part of that is that government programs do always have trade-offs. They always have trade-offs. If you want lower costs, you're going to sacrifice quality. Or if you want more access, it's going to cost more. When you look at everything we buy in life, our phones, our cars, we actually see year after year things improve across all those dimensions. Cars can be cheaper. They're not always cheaper, but your phones are cheaper.
Mm-hmm.
Most everything we gets cheaper and higher quality, which when it's cheaper and higher quality, when it's cheaper, more people have access.
Yep.
And that's what we
It's
could
just
see
not
in our
happening
healthcare
in
system.
healthcare. Yep.
And it's not happening.
And as we see in our poll, the young people in Minnesota are seeing that. It comes through in the focus groups. It comes through in the poll. Thanks a lot.
Yep, absolutely.
All right, next up, education. We have our education policy fellow, Katrin Wigfall, with us. We don't have polling on education, and we didn't get anybody in the focus group to talk about education necessarily, but we don't really need it. We know the education story in Minnesota, our once vaunted great education. That's kind of the false promise. You're going to get a great education in Minnesota. We're an education state. We got education governor, but that is a false promise. So why don't you walk us through some of the data on education, Katrin?
Yes, we as a state are slipping. We're losing that advantage that we once had over states when it comes to academic achievement, and we see that reflected in national test scores. The National Assessment of Educational Progress measures students' performance in reading and math in 4th and 8th grade, and it's the only test where you can compare one state to another. And in Minnesota, we have some of the lowest scores that we've ever had in decades, ever since the test was first administered. So we have average 4th grade reading scores are the lowest they've ever been from the time the test was first administered in 1992. And this is important. It's now, the average score is now below the national average. Minnesota 4th grade reading scores are below the national average. Minnesota average 4th grade math is the lowest since 2000. Minnesota 8th grade math is the lowest since 1990. Minnesota 8th grade reading scores are the lowest since the scores were first tracked in 1998. And this is not something that just started after COVID. Certainly COVID
Yeah, you can't blame COVID.
exacerbated it, but we have seen reading and math scores in decline in both grades tested since 2017.
Mm-hmm. And then what about ours tests, the MCAs? That's another way of
Yes.
looking at it.
Yes, so we have the national tests, and then states also administer their own statewide assessment. In Minnesota, it's called the Minnesota Comprehensive Assessment, and for the first time since we started using this test, a majority of students aren't meeting standards in reading and math. So our
So
Minnesota
less than
students,
half.
yes, less than half of students
are meeting
proficient
standards.
in reading and proficient in math.
That's a sad statement on the state of Minnesota. And again, the false promise is that education is awesome in Minnesota. The data doesn't back it up.
Right. And again, these are the basic literacy and numeracy skills that students need in order to be successful once they exit the classroom. And so the concern is that we are not preparing students for that next step. And we see that even reflected in ACT scores. Are you going to go to a 4-year college, a 2-year college? Or are you just going to jump into a career? You still need those basic math and reading skills in order to be successful. And the ACT score for the class of 2023 was lower than it was for the class of 2007. It was lower than the class of 2014, 2017, 2022. We have seen this decline in the average ACT score. And the ACT also measures college and readiness. They have college and readiness benchmarks. So this measures the likelihood of a student to not drop out, to obtain a B in a class. Only 27% of the class of 2023 met all 4 of those college readiness benchmarks. And perhaps even more alarming is 34% of the 2023 graduating class met 0 of the ACT college readiness benchmarks.
So we're graduating them. They're graduating. We have a high graduation rate in Minnesota.
We do.
But they're not ready for the next level. That's another strong indication. And then, of course, the achievement gap. We talk it to death in Minnesota. We identify the problem of the achievement gap, but just it's not getting any better.
It's not. We've talked it to death for years, and the solution is always the same. And unfortunately, it's not budging our very stubborn and persistent achievement gap, not only among racial and ethnic groups, but also among high-income students and low-income students. So Minnesota comes in second to last, 49th, in terms of education racial equality among the 50 states.
Yeah, sad. All right, so that's the false promise. You're going to get a great education in Minnesota. Where's the policy betrayal? Where have we gone wrong on a policy basis to kind of get us in where we are right now?
Well, we've gone wrong in the fact that our education reform efforts are solely focused on we just need more money. Money will fix all of these problems. And so we invest a lot in our education system. Minnesota is a high spending state when it comes to education compared to other states across the country. Minnesotans want to take pride and do take pride in their education system, and they often link that to more spending and higher spending. But as I stated, with just the academic achievement levels, we aren't seeing that reflected.
It's an input,
in spending.
not
It's
an
an input,
output.
not an output. And for the claims that spending hasn't kept up with inflation, we're not spending enough, that sort of thing. Well, actually, K-12 state revenue per student, adjusted for inflation, is up 31% from 2002. Federal revenue is up. Local revenue is up. Spending is up. So we're giving school districts more money to spend, and they are spending more, and we're not seeing that in the outputs.
Yeah, and you've got this chart that you've been working on for a few years now. It just says it all in one view. I mean, you can see spending going up and achievement not keeping up.
Right. How you spend the dollars matters far more than how much you spend, and we need to, as a state, need to do a better job of ensuring that these dollars are actually getting to the students who need them.
Yeah, it's a money chart. All right, another policy issues, administrative bloat. I mean, we hear. I thought we had a handle on this, but really, dollars to the classroom is not happening. We still have too many administrators.
Right. Yeah. So, we want to make sure that our good teachers are paid well. And the concern is that the dollars that school districts get, there's limited dollars, they have to be divided up, that too many of those dollars are going to add admin positions. And so I tracked, well, how have the positions changed over the years? Well, from 2000 to 2021, there's been a 43.2% increase in principals and assistant principals.
Yeah, but there's growth
Over
in the
40%.
system. There's growth in the system, right? The system has grown in 20 years.
No, compare that to teacher growth is at 4%, just over 4%. Student growth, 1.9%.
Okay, so really not a lot of growth in students.
Not a lot of
Holy
growth in
cow.
students over that time period. And another piece of that is for the past 4 consecutive years, the Minnesota Department of Education has reported that public school enrollment has declined. So even looking over the past several years, we can see this huge growth in principals and assistant principals that is just not kept up pace with the teacher and the student growth. And so you have to it's a head scratcher. You have to wonder, why are we adding all of these non-instructional roles to the class, to a school setting?
So they're not teaching a kid math. They're not tutoring them on how to read. They're focused on diversity, equity, inclusion. I mean, some of them, not all of them, obviously, but that's been a focus.
Yes, you have these non-instructional roles that include DEI positions, other support staff and that sort of thing that are supposed to aid teachers, but we're hearing from teachers that they don't feel supported, and it's a head scratcher for sure, and something that we need to look at more closely.
All right. Thank you very much. All right, next up, energy. We are joined by policy fellow Bill Glahn, who is one of our energy experts on staff here. And we don't have any real recent polling from young people on the energy piece, but we do have a video. We did talk to Brody, who lives in St. Cloud, who's one of the homeowners on our panel. And I think he kind of nails it. He's starting to experience what it means when electricity prices go up.
There's Sherco power plant in Becker, coal-fired power plant, is slated to shut down by the end of the decade. And they're going to replace it with, I think, 600 acres of solar panels, which is likely to increase energy bills. They're talking about how they want to charge more for peak hours and charge less for off peak. Well, obviously that's going to make all energy costs go up because many businesses like schools and such only operate during peak hours. Where are they going to shift their costs? Taxpayers. And I live in the city limits, so that's going to shift to me. So no matter how much I try to cut, even if I turn my lights off completely, I'm still going to be paying more for energy.
What Brody's talking about is this policy we have to shut down the state's coal plants and replace it with solar and wind power. Minnesota used to be one of the lowest priced states in America for electricity, and that's why we attracted heavy industry like oil refining, the iron mining up north, and other big industry. But over the years, as this chart shows, Minnesota has become one of the more expensive states for energy, and it's making it tough for those industries to compete in worldwide markets. And again, the energy policy that's driving that. Mostly this push for renewable energy capped by last year's passage of a bill that would mandate we go to 100% quote clean energy, wind and solar, by the year 2040.
We call that the blackout bill. I mean, it really is. It really does drive and we've been doing it not just this version, but in other versions from previous years, really have contributed to the rise in electricity prices in Minnesota.
Yeah, and another thing Governor Walsh has done is to use rulemaking, not the legislature, but rulemaking to get around the legislature and enact fuel standards, the so-called California fuel standards, that really are pushing electric cars, electric vehicles on Minnesota.
We love California. We love following California's lead. All right, we're joined by John Phelan, our economist, for the last three parts of the presentation. The big three, the economy, migration, and then, of course, we're going to finish with taxes in Minnesota. And we're going to start back to our poll. We asked a very common question we ask in polling: what's the most important issue heading into the 2024 election? So we asked our young people that question in this poll. 54% answered inflation, and then another 22% said jobs in the economy. So this thing is weighted completely towards the pocketbook issues. That's where our young people are. I think abortion was way down at 14%, as you can see. The environment even lower than that. So young people in Minnesota are concerned about the economy. Here's Dylan to talk about that specifically.
My parents also, when they were my age, owned a house. They didn't have the economic worries. They had an employer who took care of them, who gave them a pension. You know, my dad just retired this month. He worked for 3 companies his whole life. I, in the first 7 years of my career, have already worked at 3 companies.
Yeah, the basic way that you measure economic well-being, the basic measure of living standards is GDP per capita, which is just total goods and services, output, gross domestic product, as the different things, divided by the population of the state. It's a measure of what's available to each person in terms of living standards. And Minnesota always used to be able to say, I mean, yeah, we've got bad weather, our sports franchises suck, but we can offer you a higher than the national level of GDP per capita. And if you go back to about 2014 through to 2017, actually, you see that this level of, or this premium, as you can call it, was about $4,000 per person, per Minnesotan. That was the average gap between GDP per capita in this state and the United States generally. Since 2014, it kind of turned on a dime. It's really interesting. Since 2014, GDP per capita in Minnesota has grown more slowly in every single year than it has for the United States generally. And the result of that has been that this premium that was $4,000 or so as recently as 2017 has just collapsed. And in 2023, the most recent year for which we've got data, it was down to $43. And if you look at the quarterly data, you'll see here, you'll see that we actually slipped below the national average for the first time on record. So Minnesota is now a below average income state, which is kind of crazy.
So the false promise is we have a great economy in Minnesota. We sort of generally believe that. But the policy betrayal, you tie it back to 2014. What happened in 2014?
Well, yeah. So if you're looking at what changed, there was a reasonably big policy change back then with the institution of a new fourth top tier of income tax. Which I think, if you're looking for things that happen, that's a pretty good candidate, because, like I say, the turnaround is stark and fairly sudden. And you look at the graph, and it's just like a plane, kind of nosediving. And so, yeah, I think that's got to be a good candidate. If anybody has any other suggestions of what else happened in 2014, you let me know.
Yeah, ding, ding, ding. All right, moving on to migration then. All right, so if it's a great place to live, like Governor Walsh says, and we can put his tweet back up on the screen, young people are moving to Minnesota because of all these great things, including, free weed, marijuana, not free marijuana, but weed on demand and abortion on demand. That's what's going to drive people here. If that were true, we'd have people moving to the state, but we actually don't, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you keep seeing these rankings, CNBC rankings that get touted, and really what these rankings are, they're fantasy. So just to talk about the CNBC rankings, for example, last year what they did is they introduced this new ranking that included things like inclusion and equity and all the rest of it. It was one of the sub-indices of this index, and they bumped that up. And then it was composed of things like abortion rights, union membership, high minimum wages, and all the rest of it. Quite what this has to do with business.
Yeah,
I'm
talk to a small business
confused.
owner. I don't know what they'll
exactly. So you see these rankings, and you'd assume that a ranking of the best states for business would be somewhat correlated with what businesses actually do. But when you look at it, they're not. There's no correlation between these rankings with job creation, with business investment. So, I mean, if these are the best states for business, then why aren't businesses acting like that? CNBC also does, it's the sub-index, that inclusion, equity, etc. one. They passed that off last year as the best states to live in. And this is a really interesting one, because you saw there was a correlation between migration patterns and the best states to live in, but it was reverse.
Yikes.
So CNBC's ranking, the further you went up this ranking of the best states to live in, the more likely people were to be leaving it, according to Census Bureau and IRS data.
And as the chart shows, young people, specifically, you found young people are leaving the state of Minnesota.
Yeah, so this is another one of those things, if you look at these rankings, apparently we're this great state for young people to live, best state for millennials or whatever, but someone needs to tell millennials this, because they're not behaving like it. We are losing millennials like we're losing every other age category, actually. So in 2021, 2022, Minnesota had the 9th lowest ratio of millennial in-migrants to out-migrants. So what I do basically there is take the number of millennials that moved in, number of millennials that moved out, divide the one by the other, and you get a ratio. If it's above 1, you've got a net inflow. If it's below 1, you've got a net outflow. And if you see that chart, you'll see that we had one of the worst net outflows.
Red is bad. Green is good.
Yeah. The ratio lets you compare state to state.
Yeah. Well, here's Katerina talking about it. She's a young person who knows people who have left, and she kind of can tell you why.
I know a lot of young people who have moved since COVID. A lot. 3 to Florida, 1 to Louisiana, and 1 to Utah. And they've been great moves for them, because those places have way lower taxes, especially Florida, no income tax. So way lower taxes, way lower crime. And they've gotten good jobs in those locations too, better jobs. And they have like beach or mountain.
Well, that's well put. There you have it. I mean, great weather to boot, along with jobs and opportunity and lower taxes. These young people get it, and she's a good indication of that. So back to the poll. This is kind of one area in our polling that was kind of a disconnect. Didn't really match reality. We asked young people, are you going to stay here and raise your family? Oh, huge number, 70% said yes. Is it a good place to grow my career? Yeah, over 70% said yes. So they're saying that they're going to stay here, that Minnesota's a great place, but the data shows that they're leaving. So we stared at this for a while, and then we realized there's one problem with this poll. We didn't poll anybody that already left. Because they already left. We didn't poll anybody that never chose to come here from another state, because they never came here. So this is a poll of people who have already chosen to stay or are staying. And even when you look at that, 30% of them have on their minds that they're not going to stay. That's not a good place for a career. So that kind of explained our polling disconnect on migration. All right, let's finish with taxes. back to the poll, when it comes to taxes, and everybody knows this watching this, that Minnesota tax rates are high. We asked that in a polling a lot. We asked young people, do you think taxes are too high? Think they're too low? Think they're about just right? And here we go, the numbers. And I got to see them. 46% of young people think taxes are too high. 50% say they're just about right. 0% think they're too low. So that's tracks with the rest of the population. Young people understand taxes are too high. Here's Morgan talking about taxes.
Yeah, the taxes are crazy. I remember last summer, I live in Stillwater, and I had gone to Dairy Queen with siblings. And then like a couple weeks later, we went to Dairy Queen in Hudson, Wisconsin. And we got the exact same stuff because everyone gets the same, whatever, ice cream cone. And I couldn't believe that it was like $4 cheaper or whatever. I couldn't believe how much, like there was like $2 of taxes on whatever our bill was. And in Minnesota, we got the exact same thing, but it cost more. And like, I literally thought they rung us up wrong or something because we just bought this like 10 minutes difference away. And yeah, it was crazy.
It's absolutely true. I think that taxes in the state are too high, and they're higher than most of the country, higher than they used to be. We actually have the 6th highest top rate of state personal income tax in the US. That's 9.85%. Two interesting things to note about that, I think. One is that if you'd have asked me the ranking a couple of years ago, we'd have been about 3rd. So we've actually fallen in that ranking, which you might think is a good thing.
Hey.
But it's not because we've changed. It's because there is blue states across America are yanking their taxes up at the same time that there's this kind of big tax cutting wave in red America. And another point as well is that in the last 2 sessions at least, there have been proposals in Minnesota to institute a new top 5th tier of state income tax over 10%, around 11% if you round it, which just kind of exacerbates all the problems. Another thing to note, maybe,
and those aren't going away. Those will come back.
They come back. Yeah, none of these bad ideas go away. They all come back. So everything that gets kind of passed that's wacky has been around for a while. And I think it's worth noting that in the last session there were some tax tweaks. So, the new tax on investment income and, some of the removal of exemptions for these things, which effectively do hike the top rate of tax. I mean, they're hard to kind of capture in a simple metric, but they do effectively increase the tax burden. To go back to the migration point, we've seen a huge spike in the most recent year for which we've got data over historical averages in the number of Minnesotans over $100,000, $200,000 a year income leaving the state.
And people aren't coming in to replace them at that income level.
Yeah, and that's an interesting thing. It's perhaps worth noting that one of the biggest issues, it's perhaps a bigger problem than people leaving the state, is people not coming here. The IRS data does show you that. And it's also, I think, worth noting, we don't just tax rich people heavily here. We tax everybody pretty heavily. We often make the point that our lowest rate of state income tax is higher than the top rate in 24 states.
States that have 0 we'd be higher, but then a whole bunch of other states, their highest rate doesn't even get to our lowest rate.
Exactly.
That's a shocking statistic. Every time I hear that. How about corporate taxes?
Well, corporate tax, here we are, a clear winner. We're way at the top here.
We're number one.
Highest rate of corporate tax rate in the United States at 9.8% on the first dollar of taxable revenue. So we now have the highest rate of state corporate tax in the United States.
And again, because others are moving, it's not a static gain.
Yeah, there was so I think New Jersey and Pennsylvania, they lowered their rates. It wasn't because there was any kind of tax cutting thing going on. They'd been raised temporarily, and those temporary rates came down. So we now have the top rate of corporate income tax in the United States. It's worth noting, I think, with that because people often talk about, we've got these businesses headquartered here. Firstly, they're businesses that have been headquartered here for a very long time.
Yep.
You can trace almost every single one of them back to at least 1973, as I did a little while ago. So we're not got new businesses coming here. And the second point is that you're only taxed on the revenue in the state. When you look at a big business and it's staying in the state and you think, wow, that must be some kind of cash cow. Not really. And you have to think to yourself, I mean, if you think of a business like Target that's got operations all over the US and you think of a guy who runs a small store, that rate's applied to more of the small guys' revenues than it is to the big businesses' revenues.
Yeah, you got to look at their footprint in Minnesota.
Exactly. But that's not the only tax that we're kind of heavy on. We're one of only 12 states and the District of Columbia that has an estate tax. The estate tax kind of a wacky thing. I did one of the first study actually I did for the centre when I started here, and I think it came out in 2018. Was a study of the estate tax, and I found out, or I estimated, that it's one of those taxes that actually costs the state government money, in the sense that when you impose an estate tax, people move to avoid it.
Yeah, because they can change behavior.
Exactly. I mean, taxes are incentives. That's why they impose taxes on cigarettes and carbon.
Mm-hmm.
So what happens is people move out of the state to avoid paying the estate tax, and they take with them future payments in sales tax, income tax,
all of their
etc.
tax paying. Yeah,
Exactly.
All of it goes.
And so if you balance the one against the other, I estimated that you were losing more tax revenue by pushing people out of the state than you were bringing in with this tax. There was another paper that used, around the same time actually, that used a completely different method to estimate this and found the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And what was interesting about that paper is it found that for all the states with an estate tax, they didn't lose revenues as a result of the estate tax in the method which I said, but we did. And along with a couple of other states, and that the states that did were states that had high income taxes as well.
Yeah.
So you're faced with a choice. You can either have a very high income tax or a very high estate tax, but you can't have both.
Yeah.
And
surely if we go over to the trifecta government in St. Paul and explain all this to them, they'll immediately repeal the... No, never mind. I'm kidding. Let's go on to the gas tax. Gas tax is in the middle, but what's the problem with the gas tax now? What's the new thing?
Well, we've indexed the gas tax for inflation, which I don't think necessarily is a bad policy on its own, because as engines become more efficient, something has to be done. But it doesn't address problems with electric vehicles, for example, which, they pay some derisory fee in lieu of gas tax revenues. But they tend to be heavier vehicles than their regular gas counterparts, so they do more damage. So that's an underpayment. And also, like I say, it's okay to have... one of the few things that we have going for us is this kind of lower gas tax rate. If you're clobbering people with all the others, then you have to think about, at least the gas tax gave them some break, and now obviously that's going to diminish. So if you look at these things, what's happened, in fiscal policy in the last few years, the 2014 new top tier of income tax, I think, is a huge thing.
Yep.
Because it just, it's almost like a light switch. You see that change in GDP growth path.
It's obvious, yeah.
Yeah, and then there's last year they had, you think about migration, and you think about, there's a lot of research that shows that high taxes push people out of the state. And what did we do last year, or last session? We had a $17.6 billion budget surplus, and not only did we spend all of that, but we hiked taxes and fees by another $10 billion on top of that over the next 4 years.
Yep. Well, let's finish with Katerina. She probably sums up this presentation better than anyone in our last video clip.
The health and wellness charges in Minneapolis are so annoying. It's like I got 2 meatballs, which was supposed to be like a full plate, but it was 2 meatballs. So that's like a quarter pound of ground beef. And it was, I think, $15 or $16. And then a couple dollars for the Minneapolis city tax, a couple dollars for all the other taxes, a couple dollars for the health and wellness charge, and then a tip, and it was $30 for a quarter pound of ground beef. I was like, and I was hungry because it was a quarter pound of ground beef. It was so annoying. And I was talking to my dad about this, and he was like, you got to come to Wisconsin. This is what I'm telling you. Like, you got to come find a Wisconsin boy, pay lower taxes, and get a full plate of food for your $30.
Well, she about sums it up, John. We're back here with President John Hinterrocker. Move to Wisconsin, meet a young guy, and get a full meal for your $30. We couldn't have said it any better. Young people understand this, as we've seen throughout this presentation. How would you sum it up, and what are the takeaways, from this entire presentation, John?
Well, we've seen some pessimism here, obviously, but let me conclude with 2 optimistic takes. Number 1. The concerns that young people are expressing about life in Minnesota are real, they're rational, and they're caused by bad policy. These are issues across the country, but they're worse, as we have seen over and over again throughout this presentation, because of bad policies here in Minnesota. And so looking at that optimistically, what is caused by bad policy can be fixed by good policy. There's a lot of room here for improvement, but we have to change our ways. And then the second takeaway, I think, is, and I would address this to everybody running for office in Minnesota this year, these votes are up for grabs. They are absolutely up for grabs. The concerns that young people have are real, they're economic, they're not about things like global warming and abortion or whatever. They're concerned about their ability to make their way in the world, and they're right to be concerned. And so I think that any politician who talks realistically about these issues and about these concerns and is able to articulate some ways in which he's got policies that are going to make young people's lives better, I think that politician can get these young people's votes. I think they are totally up for grabs.
All right. Thanks a lot. That's the American Experiment podcast. Go to americanexperiment.org for more information. Thanks for listening.